Case 1. Michael Peterson, December 9, 2001. Durham County Superior Court. Few true crime cases in American history have generated as much sustained documentary coverage, courtroom drama, and public fascination as the death of Kathleen Peterson. It is a story that has been told and retold across a landmark French documentary series, a dramatic miniseries produced for a major streaming platform, and countless podcasts and retrospective specials in the years since. But underneath all of that cultural noise, it remains, at its core, exactly what it always was: the unresolved question of how a 58-year-old telecommunications executive's second marriage ended with her dead at the bottom of a staircase inside her own home. Michael and Kathleen Peterson lived together in a large, architecturally distinctive home in Durham, North Carolina, the kind of house that itself would later become almost a character in the story, endlessly photographed and dissected by investigators, journalists, and documentary crews alike. Michael was a published novelist with a background as a Marine Corps veteran and a former candidate for mayor of Durham. Kathleen was a rising, successful executive in the telecommunications industry. It was a second marriage for both of them, blending together children from previous relationships, and by the outward appearances that mattered to friends, neighbors, and colleagues, it seemed to be a genuinely happy one. On the evening of December the 8th, 2001, the couple spent time together at home, reportedly relaxing by the pool in their backyard before the night grew late. At 2:40 in the morning on December the 9th, Michael placed a call to 911, his voice audibly distressed, reporting that he had discovered his wife's body at the bottom of the staircase inside their home. The scene that greeted responding officers and later crime scene investigators was extraordinarily bloody. Far more blood, prosecutors would go on to argue at trial, than any simple accidental fall down a staircase should reasonably be expected to produce. Kathleen had sustained 7 separate lacerations to her scalp. The state's forensic pathologist, testifying for the prosecution, stated that in the course of her career, she had personally reviewed hundreds of North Carolina cases involving fatal falls down staircases, and that Kathleen's specific pattern of injuries was dramatically inconsistent with what those cases typically showed. Instead, the pathologist testified, the injuries were far more consistent with Kathleen having been struck repeatedly with a blunt object, potentially, prosecutors theorized, a fireplace tool known colloquially as a blow poke, used to stoke and adjust logs in a fireplace. Complicating the case further, and generating enormous additional public interest, prosecutors were permitted to introduce evidence at trial concerning an entirely separate death that had occurred years earlier and thousands of miles away. That of Elizabeth Ratliff, a close family friend who had died in Germany back in 1985, under circumstances that prosecutors argued bore several striking similarities to the manner of Kathleen's death. In the aftermath of Ratliff's death, Michael and his then-wife had taken on legal guardianship of her 2 young daughters. The prosecution argued that this earlier death demonstrated a disturbing pattern, and the presiding judge ultimately allowed the jury to hear about it, a ruling that would remain controversial for years to come among legal observers following the case. After one of the longest and most closely watched criminal trials in North Carolina's history, a Durham County jury convicted Michael Peterson of first-degree murder on October 10, 2003. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and it seemed, at that moment, as though the case might finally reach a settled conclusion. The story, however, was very far from over. In August of 2010, then Attorney General Roy Cooper launched a sweeping investigation into the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation's Blood Analysis Unit, prompted by extensive newspaper reporting that had raised serious, credible concerns about the reliability and integrity of the agency's forensic work across a large number of unrelated cases. That broader investigation ultimately led to the suspension of SBI analyst Dwayne Deaver, one of the key expert witnesses whose testimony had helped secure Michael Peterson's original conviction. After a review of his work across dozens of separate criminal cases, revealed it to be deeply, systematically flawed. In December of 2011, a Durham County judge formally vacated Michael Peterson's original murder conviction entirely, ruling explicitly that Duane Deaver's flawed and misleading testimony had improperly influenced the original jury's verdict. Peterson, after spending roughly 8 years behind bars, was released and placed under house arrest, while the state considered whether to pursue an entirely new trial against him. Over the years that followed, as Peterson awaited a possible retrial, his case became something of a fixture in both tabloid coverage and serious documentary filmmaking, drawing continued fascination from audiences around the world. Among the more unusual and widely mocked defense theories to emerge during this period was a suggestion, floated by some following the case, that Kathleen may have been attacked outside the home by an owl before stumbling inside and eventually falling down the staircase. A theory that drew considerable national ridicule at the time, even as some involved in analyzing the case's physical evidence never entirely dismissed it outright. Ultimately, rather than face the uncertainty and expense of an entirely new trial after so many years, Michael Peterson entered what is legally known as an Alford plea in February of 2017, pleading to the significantly reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. An Alford plea is a specific and somewhat unusual mechanism within American law that allows a defendant to formally accept a criminal conviction and its associated punishment, while simultaneously continuing to maintain, publicly and on the record, that he is innocent of the underlying crime, a position Michael Peterson has continued to hold ever since. Given credit for time already served during his original incarceration, he was released from custody following the plea. Kathleen's own family has never accepted this final outcome as anything resembling justice. Her sister, Candace Zamperini, has spoken publicly and repeatedly over the years about her unwavering personal belief that Michael was responsible for killing her sister, describing in various interviews the surreal, almost physically painful horror of sitting through a lengthy criminal trial in which the victim being discussed clinically and repeatedly in front of a courtroom was her own sibling. She has described the experience, in one particularly memorable interview, as feeling like being doused, again and again, with cold water, each time some new grim detail of Kathleen's final moments was introduced into evidence. As of this recording, the 25th anniversary of Kathleen's death is set to arrive in 2026, and the case shows absolutely no sign of losing its grip on the public imagination, continuing to generate new documentary treatments, retrospective analyses, and passionate online debate between those convinced of Michael's guilt and those who remain persuaded by alternative theories. Whether Michael Peterson killed his wife on that staircase, or whether the true story of that December night in Durham is stranger still, remains, in the strict legal sense, an open and permanently unresolved question, closed only by a plea deal that leaves both formal guilt and formal innocence technically, deliberately ambiguous. We want to be transparent with you about this particular case, as we were when we first researched it. Because of the reduced charge and the ultimately non-final nature of the legal outcome, this case sits somewhat differently within this list than several of the others we're covering tonight. We have chosen to include it both because of its overwhelming cultural significance to the true crime genre as a whole, and more importantly, because Kathleen Peterson herself deserves to be remembered clearly, specifically, and by name, not simply as a footnote to her husband's endlessly discussed legal saga. If you have thoughts on this case, we'd love to hear them in the comments below. Please like this video and subscribe to True Crime Advocate before we move on to case number 4. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 2. Jason Young, November 3, 2006. Wake County Superior Court. Michelle Young was, by nearly every account offered by those who knew her, a woman actively building the life she had always envisioned for herself. A former cheerleader at North Carolina State University, she went on to graduate with a degree in accounting, meeting her future husband, Jason Young, during a night out with friends. The two married in October of 2003, and the following year welcomed their daughter, Cassidy, into the world. In 2005, the Young family purchased a home together in a quiet, family-friendly subdivision situated near Lake Wheeler, on the outskirts of Raleigh. From the outside, viewed through the lens of neighbors and casual acquaintances, it looked very much like the American dream taking shape in real time. Friends who knew the couple more closely, however, would later describe the relationship in far less flattering terms, as genuinely volatile, marked by frequent public arguments over matters that often seemed, to outside observers, comparatively minor. Michelle's own sister, Meredith Fisher, held the candid belief that Jason was fundamentally irresponsible and emotionally immature, unable to fully step up to the demands of marriage and fatherhood. Tension within the household deepened considerably around the period when Michelle's mother, Linda, began pushing for the idea of moving in with the Young family to help with cooking, cleaning, and the demands of childcare. A proposal that Jason strongly and repeatedly opposed, seeing it, prosecutors would later suggest, as an unwelcome intrusion into his own household. Around this same general period, investigators also discovered that Jason had sent an email to a former fiancée, a woman he had once been engaged to marry, and against whom he had a documented prior history of committing acts of domestic violence, professing lingering romantic feelings for her, despite the two having had no meaningful contact in years by that point. By November of 2006, Michelle was roughly 20 weeks pregnant with the couple's second child, adding an especially painful dimension to the tragedy that was about to unfold. On the night of November the 2nd, Jason left the family home in Raleigh, telling Michelle he was departing for a business trip. Records later reconstructed by investigators showed him stopping for gas along the way, having dinner that evening at a Cracker Barrel restaurant in Greensboro, and then continuing on to visit his own mother in the town of Brevard. The following afternoon, November the 3rd, Jason placed a phone call to Michelle's sister, Meredith, asking her to stop by the family home and retrieve some printed documents related to what he described as a surprise anniversary gift he was secretly planning to buy for Michelle. A pair of designer purses he claimed he did not want her discovering in advance. When Meredith let herself into the home through a door that had been left unlocked, she made a discovery no sister should ever have to make. Michelle was dead, found lying face down in a substantial pool of blood inside the master bedroom, having suffered massive and repeated blunt force trauma to her head. A medical examiner would later testify at trial that she had been struck more than 30 separate times. In an image that would haunt the case for years to come, the couple's 2-year-old daughter, Cassidy, was found alive and, remarkably, physically unharmed, discovered hiding beneath the covers of her parents' own bed, having left small, bloody footprints tracked across the upstairs floor of the family home as she moved about, alone, in the aftermath of the attack. Investigators moved swiftly and turned their attention toward Jason almost immediately. Despite his stated alibi placing him on a business trip well outside North Carolina, a gas station attendant's records placed him physically back in the state at 5 o'clock in the morning on November the 3rd, squarely within a window of time during which he claimed to have been away entirely, and hours before Michelle's body was ultimately discovered later that day. Surveillance camera footage from the hotel where Jason was staying in Virginia appeared to go conspicuously dark during a critical stretch of that same overnight period. Investigators would go on to allege, based on this evidence, that Jason had deliberately disabled the hotel's surveillance system in order to slip away unnoticed, drive back to Raleigh, kill Michelle, and then return to his Virginia hotel room before his extended absence could reasonably be noticed by anyone. Despite the weight of this circumstantial and forensic evidence, it would take prosecutors more than 3 years to formally bring charges against Jason Young, and the case, once it finally reached trial, would ultimately require not one but 2 separate full jury trials to resolve. The first trial, held in the summer of 2011, ended in a hung jury, with jurors deadlocked at a ratio of 8-4 in favor of acquittal, a deeply frustrating outcome for Michelle's family, who had already waited years for any measure of act.